In the heart of Asia lies a country we usually associate with Genghis Khan, endless steppes, and nomadic tribes. It has no access to the sea, no ocean ports, and the nearest coastline is more than 600 miles away. And yet, this country has more ships than any other nation in the world. Ships that carry global trade and have been linked to oil spills, North Korea, Taiwan, underwater internet cables, and weapons off the coast of Somalia. How did Mongolia, which lost its access to the sea centuries ago, surpass the United States and China in the number of ships and become involved in some of the darkest criminal activities on the world's oceans? First, we need to understand how it all began. By the end of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire controlled an enormous part of the world, stretching from the outskirts of Europe to the Sea of Japan. Genghis Khan and his successors knew exactly how to conquer land. They had horsemen, archers, expertise in siege warfare, and an army capable of sweeping through foreign states with ease. This was how the largest contiguous land empire in history came into existence. But one target still remained in the southeast: China. Vast, ancient, wealthy, and still beyond Mongol control. Since 960, it had been ruled by the Song dynasty. And this was more than just a sophisticated civilization known for its art and science. Song dynasty China also possessed a powerful navy. Paddle-wheel warships equipped with trebuchets capable of launching incendiary projectiles patrolled the coast and the country's major rivers. In other words, China knew how to fight. But by the 1260s, even China was beginning to run into trouble. A Chinese defector found his way to the court of the Mongol Khan and revealed that China's navy was in terrible shape. Corrupt officials were pocketing the money that was supposed to be spent on ships. In other words, China was vulnerable, but only on one condition. The Mongols had to build a fleet of their own, and that was no easy task. Back in 1251, their main way of crossing rivers was on inflated animal skins and crude rafts. But the Khan began gathering warriors from across the empire, building ships and expanding his fleet with vessels captured in battle in 1265. The Mongols started almost from scratch, but they quickly became capable of advancing deep into China along its own waterways. And they really did manage to conquer part of China. The south, however, held out for a long time, and one battle in Yishan Bay even went down in history. The Chinese ordered 1,000 warships to be tied together, creating an enormous floating wall. The Mongols tried sending fire ships toward them, burning vessels meant to set the entire mass of ships ablaze. But the Chinese were already familiar with that tactic, so they had coated their ships in fire-resistant mud beforehand. In the end, it still didn't save them. The Mongols destroyed the maritime power they had struggled for so long to defeat. The Mongol Khan became the first Mongol emperor of China, and the Yuan dynasty replaced the Song dynasty. Just think about it. Only a few decades earlier, the Mongols had been crossing rivers on crude rafts, and now they controlled the Yuan fleet, which also kept growing. By the late 1200s, the Mongols were launching naval expeditions against Japan, Vietnam, Champa, and Java. Thousands of ships were involved. More than that, the Mongols also helped shift the Silk Road from land to sea. Under the Mongol Empire, trade expanded so dramatically that maritime routes began developing at a rapid pace. The people of the steppe ended up becoming one of the forces behind the rise of global ocean trade. Unfortunately, Mongolia's maritime history didn't last long. The Yuan dynasty began to weaken. Tensions, political intrigue, rebellions, struggles for power. Eventually, the empire fell apart. By 1370, the remaining Mongols had been forced to retreat deep into the continent. China reclaimed its territories, and Mongolia permanently lost access to the sea. Today, Mongolia is landlocked. Its capital, Ulaanbaatar, lies more than 800 miles from the ocean, and Mongolia itself is the largest landlocked country in the world. And yet, around 4,700 vessels are registered under the Mongolian flag, an absolutely enormous merchant fleet. And for some reason, hardly anyone ever talks about it. So, where are all these ships? Could they be sailing along rivers inside Mongolia? The country has around 360 miles of navigable waterways, including the Selenga and Orkhon rivers. But even a quick look makes it clear that no massive fleet's hiding there. There are vessels, of course, but very few of them. Besides, Mongolia's lakes and rivers freeze during the winter and are generally navigable only from May through September. Building a huge river fleet for such a short season wouldn't make much sense. So perhaps Mongolia has some unusual form of access to the sea. Maybe a leased stretch of coastline or a foreign port. No? Mongolia has no seaports of its own, and the nearest ocean, as I mentioned earlier, is more than 600 miles away. So there's no point looking for these ships in Mongolian harbors. Mongolia doesn't have any harbors. But perhaps these aren't seagoing vessels at all. Once again, no. These statistics specifically refer to ocean-going ships, container ships, tankers, bulk carriers, and other large vessels. Many of them operate all over the world and have never come anywhere near Mongolia. In fact, when people talk about Mongolia's navy, they often think not of thousands of merchant ships, but of a meme. In 2001, a documentary claimed that Mongolia really did have a navy of its own. The only catch was that it consisted of a single tugboat and a 7-man crew. The tugboat is called the Sukh-Batar 3 and it patrols Lake Kavgal. According to the documentary, budget cuts effectively forced the Sukh-Batar 3 to transport cargo and tourists across the lake whenever it wasn't on active duty. In other words, it was technically a military vessel, but it also had a few side gigs. Lake Kavgal is completely surrounded by Mongolian territory and lies within a beautiful national park. So it's fairly easy to understand why this navy hasn't seen much combat, and perhaps that's for the best, because according to the documentary, as of 2001, only one of Mongolia's 7 sailors actually knew how to swim. But jokes aside, we still need to understand how Mongolia ended up with thousands of ships. And to do that, we need to look not at Mongolia itself, but at global trade. At any given moment, an enormous number of vessels are sailing across the world's oceans. They carry around 90% of global trade. Almost every country participates in this system in one way or another. Some own ships, some use them, some receive cargo, and others send it. And the entire system is regulated through an extremely complicated web of international and transnational rules. Wherever there's a complicated system, loopholes almost always appear. One such loophole is the so-called flag of convenience. This is where a merchant vessel is registered not in the country where its owner lives or operates, but in another sovereign state. A country that allows foreign vessels to sail under its flag is known as an open registry state. But don't assume this is some obscure practice on the fringes of global shipping. 3 such registries, Liberia, the Marshall Islands, and Panama, currently account for around 40% of the world's merchant fleet by tonnage. Altogether, roughly 3/4 of the global merchant fleet is registered under flags of convenience. The ship is formally registered under one country's flag, but is in reality connected to another. A ship can be owned by someone from one country, staffed by a crew from another, operate all over the world, and be registered in yet another country. But why would ship owners choose these registries when the whole arrangement looks like such an international mess? The answer is simple: money. Registering under a flag of convenience often means lower fees and little to no taxation. And once that's done, many ship owners look for further savings. They hire the cheapest labor available, pay the lowest possible wages, and cut costs at the expense of the crew's living and working conditions. For the countries involved, it's also a convenient source of income. They can collect money from ship owners without assuming the kind of real responsibility for crew safety and welfare expected of responsible maritime nations. Naturally, this is often bad news for sailors. Most people working aboard vessels flying flags of convenience aren't unionized. And even when they are, their unions often have very little power to influence what happens on board. And the system isn't used only to save money. In many ways, these registries are the maritime equivalent of offshore financial centers. They allow people to conceal the true owners, reduce costs and taxes, strip transparency down to the bare minimum, and at the same time cover up criminal activity. And now it becomes clear why Mongolia became part of this system in the first place. The Mongolia Ship Registry lists the advantages of sailing under its flag: competitive fees and taxes, no tax on profits or capital gains, and recognition of IMO standards and crew certificates, plus fast service. They promise to issue certificates within an hour. Honestly, I've never seen bureaucracy move that quickly. There's another important benefit. Ships flying the Mongolian flag can't simply be seized for government use. And the Mongolia Ship Registry places no restrictions on who can own a registered vessel. So you get an incredibly convenient package. You pay less, get your paperwork faster, and don't really owe anyone much of anything. But ships have a limited lifespan too. On average, vessels are decommissioned, scrapped, or recycled after roughly 20 to 32 years, depending on the type of ship. After that, they're generally considered unsafe to operate and are supposed to be dismantled. And more often than not, these ships end up right here in Alang, It's a city on India's western coast and the world's largest shipbreaking center. For roughly half of the world's ocean-going ships, this is their final stop. Alang is essentially a ship graveyard. Ships that were once enormous, powerful, and incredibly expensive come here to die. Then workers armed with the most basic tools take them apart piece by piece. But this isn't like a whale graveyard where the animals simply beach themselves. There has to be a reason why people choose Alang, and I found it. First, the coastline is perfect. Alang has powerful tides, and the beach's natural slope makes it possible to get ships directly onto the shore. But the main reason is that there are plenty of people willing to work for low pay and harsh and sometimes deadly conditions. On top of that, India's environmental and safety regulations are less strict than those in the countries these clients come from: Japan, South Korea, Russia, Germany, and the United States. So where am I going with all this? Alang is the only possible destination for an aging ship. You can decommission it and admit that it's too old, too dangerous, and too expensive to maintain. But that means giving up the profits. As long as a vessel can somehow be kept running, its owners will try to keep it running until the bitter end. That's where the Mongolian flag becomes useful for more than just low taxes and fast paperwork. Register your decrepit old ship in Mongolia and you can keep sailing it until it finally sinks. No one's going to stop you, and it's not exactly uncommon. Ships flying the Mongolian flag have repeatedly been involved in life-threatening accidents. In November 2003, 13 Russian sailors had to be rescued from the Mongolian-flagged vessel Fest. It was carrying timber when its engine failed and the ship began sinking in the Sea of Japan. Afterward, Mongolia promised to stop registering vessels more than 30 years old, but the problems didn't go away. In 2014, 2 North Korean sailors died aboard a Mongolian-flagged vessel when their cargo ship sank off the coast of South Korea. And just so you understand, an accident involving an old ship isn't only a problem for the crew. In 2009, the Mongolian-flagged cargo ship MV Black Rose sank off the coast of India near the port of Paradip. After oil leaked into the water, fish and other marine life began dying along the coastline. Oil's dangerous to virtually every form of marine life that comes into contact with it. There isn't a single species that goes like, "Yay, pollution, I love this." In fur-bearing marine mammals, such as sea otters, oil damages the fur. In birds, it damages the feathers. As a result, the animals lose their natural protection from water and cold and may die of hypothermia. Young sea turtles can become trapped in the oil. Dolphins and whales may inhale it, damaging their lungs, immune systems, and reproductive functions. Many birds and animals also swallow oil while trying to clean themselves, which can poison them. Fish, mollusks, and corals are all in grave danger, and even when they don't die immediately, that doesn't mean everything is fine. Oil contamination can make them unsafe for the people who later eat that seafood. Anyway, you get the point. Cut costs here, cut costs there, and eventually you end up with an environmental disaster. And if you're lucky, no one gets killed. Still, old ships aren't dangerous just because they might break down at sea. They also can't handle rough weather all that well. A few large waves and a ship that was already barely holding together can quickly become a problem for everyone around it. In 2023, for example, a Mongolian-flagged cargo ship sank in the Taiwan Strait. All 8 crew members were rescued, but the point still stands. And if the storm is truly powerful, in July 2024, Taiwan was hit by Typhoon Gami, the strongest typhoon to hit the island in 8 years. Schools, businesses, and airports were shut down, thousands of people were temporarily evacuated, several people died, and the sea became so violent that the Coast Guard couldn't deploy either aircraft or patrol boats. Waves between 16 and 23 feet high, winds of up to 118 miles an hour, and several ships happened to be off Taiwan's southern coast at the time. None of them had an easy ride. First, the Tanzanian-flagged cargo ship Fushun sent out a distress signal. There were 9 people on board and the vessel was listing heavily, and 45 minutes later, rescuers were informed that it had sunk. 3 crew members were later found on the coast, while the other 6 went missing. Then it became clear that Fushun wasn't the only problem. The large bulk carrier Hedwig Oldendorf also briefly issued a distress call, but later reported that it was safe. It was a large, solid, properly built ship, so the storm certainly gave it a beating, but the bulk carrier ultimately made it through. The smaller cargo ships didn't fare nearly as well. Several vessels were simply driven ashore. Among them was Basha, a small Mongolian flagship. Several other small cargo vessels were washed ashore nearby. That's how it works. When old, small ships sailing under flags of convenience get caught in a major storm, they often become the weakest link. They lose control and sink, and then the problem's no longer limited to rescue operations. There's also the risk of fuel leaks, water pollution, and yet another accident along the coast. But accidents are only one part of the problem. Mongolian flag ships don't just turn up in stories involving breakdowns, storms, and sinkings. As I mentioned earlier, they've also been linked to all kinds of criminal activity. In 2003, for example, one such vessel was suspected of being used by an international criminal organization to smuggle illegal migrants. And in December 2012, another Mongolian flag ship was detained by the Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency. This time, it was suspected of smuggling diesel fuel. In other words, a flag of convenience can only serve as a convenient cover for some very dark business. And then there's... No, wait, this part needs a little backstory too. Ships at sea aren't supposed to simply disappear. That's what AIS, the Automatic Identification System, is for. It transmits a ship's name, type, position, course, and speed to other vessels and coastal authorities. When everything's working normally, a ship can be tracked almost in real time. For large vessels, AIS is mandatory. International regulations require passenger ships and sufficiently large cargo vessels to carry it. And the system's supposed to remain switched on at all times. But AIS can be turned off. Of course, the ship doesn't vanish, it's still moving across the sea, but to anyone monitoring maritime traffic, it casts an invisibility spell and disappears. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration examined cases like these involving fishing vessels. Researchers analyzed more than 28 billion AIS signals recorded between 2017 and 2019 and identified over 55,000 instances where the system had been switched off. Altogether, these shutdowns concealed roughly 6% of global fishing vessel activity. Sometimes there may have been a legitimate reason to keep competitors from discovering a fishing location or to pass through pirate-infested waters unnoticed, but vessels also frequently disappeared near the boundaries of exclusive economic zones, in fish-rich areas, in disputed waters, or when they were catching more fish than permitted. Now put those two facts together. A ship may operate under a flag of convenience that makes accountability harder to establish. Then it can switch off its AIS and disappear from tracking systems. The result is a ship that's officially registered in one country, operates somewhere on the other side of the world, belongs to no one knows who, and simply vanishes at sea whenever it needs to. And as though that weren't enough, the Mongolian flag can also be used to evade international sanctions. North Korea has been under sanctions for years and has repeatedly used foreign registries to conceal its maritime activities. Ships flying foreign flags have been used to smuggle drugs and weapons, among other things. Eventually, Mongolia was forced to respond. It revoked North Korean vessels' right to sail under its flag. The Mongolian government also terminated contracts with 14 North Korean ships that were still operating through its registry. But the problems didn't end there, because the Mongolian flag later appeared near Taiwan, and not in a good way. In January 2025, the Taiwanese Coast Guard spotted a suspicious cargo ship called Baoshun near the coast. It was sailing under the Mongolian flag, but it had a Chinese name. It was also following a strange route directly through an area containing undersea cables. And undersea cables aren't just wires lying on the ocean floor, they carry communications, internet traffic, and data. If one of those cables is damaged, an island can face serious problems. The ship spent more than a day circling near Ximen off New Taipei City. At one point, it came within roughly 1,520 feet of the shore. The Coast Guard then dispatched a patrol boat and forced it farther out to sea. And this is where we need to take a closer look at the ship's history. It appears to have been built back in 2005 as a Chinese vessel. At the time, it sailed under the Chinese flag and was called Shuntai 188. It was later renamed several times before finally receiving its current name in 2023, along with Mongolian registration. So technically, the ship off the coast of Taiwan wasn't Chinese at all, it was Mongolian. But in fact, it was a vessel with a Chinese history, a Chinese name, and some suspiciously Chinese-looking behavior around Taiwan's infrastructure. But perhaps the strangest example of Mongolia's flags of convenience has nothing to do with old ships or all this back and forth involving China and North Korea. It has to do with arms control. Off the coast of Somalia, floating armories began operating in international waters as part of the effort to combat piracy. These are vessels that store weapons and house personnel, allowing passing ships to quickly bring armed security teams aboard and drop them off after crossing the Gulf of Aden. And the basic logic makes sense. The area is dangerous and ships need protection. But who's supposed to keep track of all those weapons? Responsibility for regulating the weapons and other material carried on board falls to the country whose flag the vessel flies. And when the flag state does a poor job of monitoring the storage and transfer of military equipment, these ships can operate with virtually no oversight. And it appears that some security providers are using Mongolian-flagged vessels for precisely this purpose, for fairly obvious reasons. At least 32 vessels operating as floating armories have been identified in or near the region. 8 of them were sailing under Mongolian flags of convenience, while another 2 are believed to have been doing the same. And this is actually far more serious than it might sound. Mongolia appears on several international blacklists, which means the weapons aboard these vessels may effectively go unregistered. The ships themselves operate without proper oversight or regulation. In other words, there's a huge stockpile of weapons floating around in waters full of pirates. What could possibly go wrong? And that leaves us with the main question. What does Mongolia itself get out of all this? The answer is simple: money. It's almost impossible to find any reliable information about how the revenue is divided between the companies that operate the registry and the Mongolian Maritime Administration. Even some of the world's best investigative journalists were unable to get anyone to respond. Still, there is one clue. In 2014, the Mongolian Maritime Administration was expected to generate 274.4 million tugriks in revenue, around $140,000. For a landlocked country, that money most likely came from selling its flag. Of course, that doesn't sound like much. And experts believe the true revenue was probably higher, especially considering that in 2013 only around 168 vessels sailed under the Mongolian flag. Today that number's close to 5,000. And if the scale of the operation has grown that dramatically, the profits must have grown as well. But there's one apparent contradiction here. If roughly 90% of global trade moves by sea, how does a country with no coastline and no ports survive? Mongolia is enormous, roughly the size of Alaska. But it has very little arable land. Most of the country is covered by steppe, with mountains stretching across the north and west, and the Gobi Desert occupying the south. In other words, Mongolia can't rely on domestic agriculture alone, but goods still have to enter the country somehow. And since Mongolia has no ports of its own, it uses ports in neighboring China and Russia. Cargo arrives at their seaports and is then transported inland by rail. So, Mongolia depends on other countries' ports for its own trade, while a significant share of global shipping formerly depends on Mongolia. It's a curious paradox. You owe me a like. See you later.